And good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Apologize for a couple minutes late. We're interested to have you here with us. My name is Will Hubbard, Vice President of Government Affairs at Student Veterans of America, and today we'll be discussing the VA Reform Bill and what it means for student veterans. Joining me here are Steve Gonzalez from the American Legion and Ryan Gallucci from the Veterans of Foreign Wars. So to kick this off, we'd like to just give a brief overview of what the intent of the bill was. We'll go into some of the history, talk about the provisions that matter to student veterans. So first of all, the provision that will matter and be of interest to most student veterans, that is the in-state provision, in-state tuition for student veterans. What this bill, the intent of it, as far as the in-state provision goes, was looking to do was to provide veterans the opportunity to cover the gap that would otherwise exist, which was a result of them being stateless for their service. Being moved around a lot from the military, it's often difficult to establish residency in any single state, and this provision was meant to address that. It was to allow individuals to start school immediately at the in-state tuition rate versus waiting a year to establish residency. So Steve and Ryan will go into some more of the details. We'll also be covering the Sergeant Fry Scholarship for families of the fallen, so that will be in here as well. So Ryan, I'm going to hand it over to you to look at the history of the bill and where it came from.
Thanks, Will. As Will said, my name is Ryan Gallucci. I'm the Deputy Director for the National Veterans Service for the Veterans of Foreign Wars. So what that means is our department is basically responsible for benefits delivery to veterans, and that includes the full scope of benefits, disability benefits, health care. But what I focus on is education, employment, other transition issues, which is why I'm here today to talk a little bit about the in-state tuition protection for veterans. So the history of this effort. This was a long-fought issue that Student Veterans of America, the Veterans of Foreign Wars, and the American Legion have been working on for quite some time. So as many of you know, the post 9/11 GI Bill offers up to the cost of in-state tuition for students attending public colleges and universities. Now, the gap that our organizations had identified over the years was that a student veteran attending a public college or university would often have to make up the difference between the cost of in-state tuition and the cost of out-of-state tuition. Now, a good example of this would be in Florida, where the cost of in-state tuition at their flagship university is about $6,000 a year, compared to out-of-state, which is about $28,000 a year. And the veteran, even if you were 100% eligible for that benefit, was on the hook for that additional $22,000 in tuition every year. And what we found in talking to student veterans year in and year out is that many times they were considered stateless for tuition purposes, as Will alluded to before. And what this means, what this was the result of their military service. So they'd move from, as a service member, you would move from duty station to duty station at the whim of the military. And many times you may retain your residency back home, or you may change your residency to your current duty station so you can vote in your community. Now what would happen is when a service member would come off of active duty, they would now be stateless for tuition purposes, again, like Will said. So what we know, there seemed to be a bit of a misconception on this, and it was because many people thought, well, as long as you're a resident of that state, you qualify for in-state tuition. Well, not exactly. In-state tuition requirements for public colleges and universities, while they rely a little bit on residency, they also have a physical presence clause, which means you have to be physically present in that state for a certain amount of time before you qualify for in-state tuition. Now, another common misconception was, well, student veteran can go, they can attend that school for a year, and then after a year they'll be a resident, right? They'll get in-state tuition. Again, it wasn't quite that simple, because what happens is if you are already enrolled in an academic program in many of these states, you're disqualified from ever attaining residency for tuition purposes at that college or university. So once you were attending, you were locked in at that rate. So the goal of our campaign for the three organizations, VFW, SVA, and American Legion, was to make sure that no veteran would have their military service held against them when seeking to attend a public college or university. Now, in the beginning of this, what we were asking for was, states just have to offer in-state tuition to veterans. It's the right thing to do. And at the beginning of the 113th Congress, House Veterans Affairs Committee Chairman Jeff Miller agreed with us and introduced a bill alongside Ranking Member Mike Michaud, Democrat from Maine, that would basically make states offer in-state tuition to veterans if they wanted to accept GI Bill dollars. Now, this was received with some mixed reviews in Congress. Chair Miller stood by his guns and said this is the right thing to do. Veterans didn't serve their state, they served the country. Now, what happened is, fast forward a couple of months, the appetite for Congress to take up the full in-state protection wasn't really there. A lot of offices thought it may have some constitutional issues with dictating in-state tuition for states. So our organization sat down with some leaders in the Senate and had a very candid conversation. They said, okay, who are you trying to help? And at this point, we said, look, the transitioning service member who's stateless for tuition purposes, the serviceman or woman who just separated from the military and regardless of where they want to attend college isn't considered an in-state student. And that's really where the provision that passed in law came from, because it's a 3-year window of opportunity for a recently transitioned service member or their dependent to qualify for in-state, to be accepted at the in-state rate at a public college or university. We're not saying carte blanche, you go across the country and you're just an in-state student at any college you choose. And I usually use myself as an example of this. So I'm a veteran. I used my GI Bill for my education. But the thing is, I've been out of the military since 2007. And now I live in Virginia. So if I want to go to a public college or university, there's ample opportunity for me to attend the college or university of my choice in Virginia. So I guess a good question would be, how did we get this done? So our 3 organizations came together last summer and formally launched the In-State for Vets campaign, which you may have seen on studentveterans.org under what we do. In-state tuition, it was a big map, where a 50-state map showing which states allowed veterans to attend at the in-state rate, which states didn't, which ones had pending legislation, and which ones were special circumstances where the school system would let veterans attend at the in-state rate. Good examples of this were Michigan, Iowa is another one where their governor said, we think our university system can do this. And so that really, the culmination of this campaign was really the passage of the Veterans Access, Care, and Accountability Act, which included the in-state provision. I think I'm going on and on about this, so definitely, yeah, let's look at some examples of what's happened over the last couple of years, or over the last year with the In-State for Vets campaign.
Good afternoon, everyone. Steve Gonzalez, Assistant Director of the American Legion Veterans Employment and Education Division. We, like Ryan and our colleagues within SVA and VFW, our division covers anything that economically impacts service members, veterans, and their families. So this is one of the things that we've realized would impact certain service members, or we should say veterans, since the Higher Education Act does protect service members who are stationed anywhere outside of their home of residence that's been somewhere for 90 consecutive days are protected on the HEA. However, once you transition out, you're no longer an individual who's covered by that, which again will provide a big gap between what your in-state rate would have been and what GI Bill covers, and then of course what you will have to cover as an individual, which of course can hurt your economic well-being, which would create this particular situation where you will have to borrow particular money, create an actual burden on you as an individual who's decided to serve their country. Like Ryan has stated before, and same thing with Will, we had decided that we were not just solely going to rely on the federal government, so we also took it upon ourselves with our organizations, working with our respective members, and in some cases overlapping members, to work with state legislators, to work with state governors' offices, but also to work within the confines of our states to testify in front of the state legislative bodies, to work with our state assembly, state representatives to pass legislation, or in some other states in situations where university systems had the authority or the jurisdiction to actually change policy, work with those institutions that would allow for waivers to be granted, of course, within a reasonable time where an individual did transition out, to ensure that you as an individual is allowed to go get your higher ed or higher education attainment, at the same time not creating a financial burden on you where you really didn't have a say in where you went, where you stood, or where you transitioned out of. In that particular situation, I will say prior to the passage of the VA Reform Bill, of course having the provision in there which is considers Section 702 of the provision itself, we had been successful within the last year and a half passing state legislation in some form within Arizona, Colorado, Florida, Idaho, Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, Louisiana, Maine, Maryland, Minnesota, Texas, Utah, Virginia, Washington, and Wyoming, where we've been successful. And we've been successful because you, as our members, allowed us to be successful and work with us from a national and state to actually have this impact on you. And now, coming from Washington, D.C., we've been able to pass it on a national level that ensures that we protect all veterans who are transitioning out. That is kind of from, I guess, from the Legion's historical perspective on where we've been at, where we're working on. And I definitely will, I think the next part, and I will say this, we're not done yet, and I will allow my colleague Will to lead into what are some of the next barriers, I should say, or what are the next moving ahead, what's going to be taken from our organizations and how we're going to continue to make sure that you're taken care of in one form or another.
Thanks, Steve. So, as Steve mentioned, there's definitely barriers ahead. Off the bat, I think a lot of folks want to know, when does this impact us? When does this impact me as a student veteran? This goes live next academic year, so 2015. It's not going to impact you tomorrow. If you're a school, you've got plenty of time to work out the rules and regulations to make this work. And so there's definitely ample time to make sure this is a smooth transition, this smooth process, and that the intent of the law is managed effectively. As far as a plain language interpretation of the bill, I think it's sometimes not always clear how this plays out. But very simply, this bill, what it does is it requires schools to offer in-state tuition for veterans. If they do not choose to offer in-state tuition rates to veterans, then they will not be eligible for GI Bill dollars. So that's the very simple interpretation of it. As far as some of the challenges ahead, we're looking at the rulemaking process right now. So this is a fight it's hard to fight. We had the support of a lot of our members out there. A lot of you made this possible for us. And what we're looking at right now is the next fight, the next frontier. And that's going to be the rulemaking process. We're going to have to figure out how the regulations are written and how this impacts schools. Also, what waivers potentially might be granted or requested by various states or schools. So we're going to be working through those issues. So I'm going to hand it over to Ryan to take a little bit of a deeper look at what those waivers might look like and how that might play out.
Now, some of you may have seen a recent article in the Military Times publications by George Altman that talked about some of the confusion in the language and what exactly it means. And we've also heard some concerns, Steve, Will, and I, from schools in particular, worrying about, okay, well, this is a cost issue. First off, cost should never enter into this conversation. It's something that we don't feel holds much merit. Student veterans bring a tremendous amount of guaranteed money in post 9/11 GI Bill dollars to those campuses, whether it's through tuition and fees, but then through the lucrative living stipend benefit. And as alumni, exactly. That's a really good point. But one of the confusing parts in the way that the bill is written is it could be interpreted either way. So will the veteran not be eligible, or will the school not be eligible? And this is something that we feel will be hashed out in the rulemaking process. But from the discussions that we've had, the intent of the legislation is that the school would be ineligible if they refuse to accept veterans at the in-state rate within that 3-year window from the time of separation. Beyond that, as far as the waivers process, there was a concern that student veterans would not be allowed to enroll at schools that were unable to comply by next summer. We view the waiver process as an absolute last-ditch, last-resort effort, and even then, it's something that our organizations will advocate against. Now, that being said, the purpose of the waiver process is to make sure that no veteran is locked out from an education that they want to pursue using their GI Bill dollars. That being said, we think that there's really no excuse for why a public university system couldn't make this work. And the best practical example that I can think of from our recent state-by-state advocacy effort is really the state of Florida. Now, I know this was a concerted effort on the part of our 3 organizations locally. From a VFW perspective, our state legislative chairman, Mark Alvarez, worked incredibly close with the Student Veterans of America chapter at Florida State University to lobby the State House to make it happen. And there was a lot of reluctance on the part of Florida. And the reason is because Florida has one of the largest veterans populations in the country. But on the other hand, as I mentioned earlier, it also has a very lucrative in-state tuition benefit for its residents. The difference of about $22,000 a year. Now, in our opinion, this was really a bellwether moment for the in-state tuition campaign. And it was because if Florida can really make this work, then other university systems really don't, I'll be blunt, they don't have an excuse. Those who are concerned about the finances behind this, we've taken a look at a couple of states. One of the larger states that hasn't been on board with the in-state tuition policy. Veterans enrolled in their public colleges and universities account for 0.006% of their total budget. So again, this is, if you're really concerned about the money, there are other places to make this up. We view this as the right thing to do by veterans because, as Steve mentioned, the protection is there for active duty service members. So if you're a service member stationed in, I'll use North Carolina as an example. If you're in North Carolina and you ETS out of the Army from Fort Bragg, that day that school can start charging you the out-of-state rate if you don't have your T's crossed and your I's dotted. And we've seen it happen. We've heard from veterans who that's happened to. We view that as a problem. Veterans, we believe that veterans should never have their military service held against them when determining in-state residency. Another common misconception, I think we talked about this a little bit earlier, was that this is for all veterans across the board. That is flatly not the case. This was drafted as a transitional protection for veterans who can't qualify for in-state tuition because of circumstances out of their control, specifically military service.
Thing, and it's something Ryan had alluded to. An example will also be the University of California system. They have 10 campuses throughout the state of California with a revenue stream of $22.5 billion. I am pretty sure, as California has been one of the states who's been very much in opposition, I'm pretty sure with the large military bases in California, the money is being really flown in, or say put into the state of California through our military service members and the sacrifices they made, but also through the economic empowerment, or say the economic flow of money into to the counties and where the bases are at. And then, of course, the education system pretty much is larger than 223,000 staff with a $22 billion revenue stream. I'm pretty sure they can provide some waivers, if not many, to all of our veterans who are transitioning into the UC system. So again, California is being one of the states. I'm pretty sure some of the other states that if you go to, again, the SVA website and look at the map that are still red will want to change their mindset. And I will say, I have to also say this, North Carolina is another one. Oklahoma is another state. I would say they want to take a really hard look at this and make sure that they're taking care of their veterans, since those particular states house military installations, and you definitely want to make sure that as policymakers of those particular states, they stand by the veterans, they stand by the service members that they have no problem sending to war, but when we come back, we have to make sure that they're able to readjust and come back into civilian society, and of course education is one of those key components.
So we're going to, in a moment, take some questions. Before we jump into that, we thought it was also worthwhile to highlight the Sergeant Fry Scholarship that passed along with the bill. This is an interesting provision that we were all happy to support, which would allow for scholarships for families of the fallen. This is something that's been of a historical effort, which we have seen previously and there's precedent for, and now, fortunately, for many members of service members, members of the family, they will have this opportunity. So that's if you're a dependent or you're a family member of a service member who's given it all for the country, then I recommend taking a look at that. Brian, did you want to share a little bit more?
No.
Sure.
I want to add a little bit more on the expansion of the Fry Scholarship. So when the Frye Scholarship was first commissioned through the post 9/11 GI Bill, it was strictly for children of fallen service members. And what this expansion is really, so VFW and American Legion are resolution-based organizations. Our members give Steve and I our marching orders on what we do. And from a VFW perspective, for years we had a resolution that said expand Dependents Educational Assistance Program, which is the chapter of the GI Bill for surviving spouses and children of the fallen. And the reason we had that resolution is because the reimbursement for the benefit, which acronym is DEA, had fallen well out of pace with the cost of education. So our resolution was usually ensure the DEA keeps pace with the cost of education. Now, the Gunnery Sergeant Frye Scholarship came along and provided post 9/11 GI Bill benefits to children of the fallen. Very outstanding benefit, helping the children of fallen service members have access to an education. But what was missing from this was the spouse piece. So we know that a lot of spouses of the fallen from the current conflict are younger. They may not have children. They may have children who are approaching grade school age. And now they've become the sole provider for that family. We thought that they were at a distinct economic disadvantage to only have access to that meager DEA benefit. And Congress hadn't really shown an inclination to adjust DEA so it would be commensurate with the cost of education. And so it seemed like a natural policy progression to say we need to expand the Frye Scholarship so that these younger spouses, these sole breadwinners for the families, can now have access to a quality education with which they can acquire the skills to find quality careers.
Great. So we're going to start taking some questions here. You can submit them through the Google Hangout, and our moderator will share them with us, and we will take them one by one. So the question is, how would waivers affect those who are in online schools? Steve, do you want to take a crack at this?
From my understanding, this particular situation with in-state does not apply to online. As long as, from my understanding, it's mostly for public institutions and with residency issues or addressing residency as far as an individual who is attending a public institution within a particular state. Unless I must misread and not interpret this correctly, it's a brick and mortar university, public university that has a either in-state rate or out-of-state rate, and it doesn't really apply to anything that has to do with online as much as it doesn't apply to other institutions outside of that for right now.
Right. Next question.
So, do we need to focus on educating veterans as to which institutions are the best choices for their academic goals?
So that's a good question. The question is, does paragraph C of the law, does that set up competition among public schools for student veterans? That's a great question. First off, slightly different, but we'll come back to that. We do believe that public schools as a whole have the opportunity to offer a more flexible education for student veterans. This is something that's really important, and I think touches on this in a tangential way. Currently, the way higher education is set up, it does not necessarily afford the flexibility that a lot of student veterans who are non-traditional students would be seeking. So I would put that point in there, and I'll. Does anyone want to jump in? Yeah, please.
Okay. To touch on this, so Section 702C of the law basically outlines what the protection is, and so it's who's covered, which benefit is covered, and it's basically the meat of the bill. And as far as creating competition among public schools, I don't necessarily see it that way. And the reason is because I'll give one example of one of the states that was concerned about in-state tuition. South Carolina, there was a state legislator who was worried oh, well, now South Carolina schools are going to be flooded with veterans who are coming here just for our in-state tuition benefits. This is when they were talking about their state bill. The problem is South Carolina was surrounded by states that offered in-state tuition to their veterans at public colleges and universities. So Florida had opened up their schools to offering in-state tuition to veterans. Georgia, North Carolina, it was moving in their state legislature. So for this one state legislator in South Carolina, I think his concern was moot. All we want to do is offer veterans who may have come from South Carolina or may be stationed at one of the numerous military installations in South Carolina, and we're pursuing pursuing higher education at a South Carolina state school to be able to get that in-state rate at that school. Now, to build on competition, that's to me this is a really interesting question, and the reason is because I want public schools to compete for student veterans. I want them to welcome student veterans with open arms, and I think where we've seen states aspiring to do that, we've seen student veterans flocking to those schools, and not necessarily even states, but then campuses that want to be veteran-friendly. Florida State, again, is a great example. The Florida State's university president made an investment in their student veterans community. The state of Ohio was one of the first to offer in-state tuition across the board to veterans who wanted to come to Ohio. We'll even give San Diego State University in California a lot of credit for the robust programs that they created for veterans. We think this is a good thing. Many public colleges and universities offer a quality education, which is one of the reasons the post-9/11 GI Bill was drafted around the whole premise of offering a free public education to veterans who served after 9/11.
This bill also doesn't create an argument for, I would say, for competition, as competition has always been there. Institutions of higher learning are nothing more than businesses. So when they create new buildings, they create new facilities, when they expand their campuses, that is their way of competing for not just student veterans, but for all students to come to their school. And I have to agree with both my colleagues. We want them to compete. We want to make sure that the programs they have is tailored to our needs, our necessities, to ensure that we can be successful. In addition to that, for those, we look at higher ed or education as nothing more, as a product, and as a consumer, it's why our three organizations has worked very hard with the Department of Education, Department of Veteran Affairs, and Department of Defense to create the comparison tool. Even though it's in its infancy stages, and as it continues to evolve into what we hope would be a good tool and a great tool for veterans and service members and their families when they are picking the right product for what their needs are, that will help them understand a lot better and what school is best for them and what is going to allow them to be successful and be economically empowered to allow them to be successful just like any other generation of veterans.
Making informed decisions, very important. What's our next question? Can we spend a few moments talking about VRAP? So, the thing about VRAP, has it been reconstituted? No. They extended it for a period of time to basically cover the folks who are enrolled in the program currently to be able to finish out. It has not been reauthorized since that point. It was an interesting program that had a very targeted audience. Ultimately, I think our focus is on the bigger fish, and that is the GI Bill. The GI Bill has offered such an extensive network of opportunities to veterans to go into higher education. We've seen the return on that investment to be huge. VRAP, while a great program for some, has not been as big of a focus as the GI Bill. I'll let these two jump in, but that's my perspective.
All right. VRAP was something that our organizations were very supportive of, and it offered older veterans an opportunity to close the skills gap if they had exhausted other education programs and found themselves unemployed. That being said, the way the program was written, we did identify some problems that, at least from my perspective, kept some veterans from taking full advantage of the program. And I think that's why a lot of veterans who have contacted our organizations have called for us to expand it. We've had these conversations with both the House and Senate Veterans Affairs Committees. There is a bill in the House that seeks to expand it. We've generally expressed our support for it. The problem is, committee leadership, I think they viewed VRAP really as a temporary program. They never viewed it to be a permanent benefit. And one of the things that we're still waiting on is Department of Labor outcome data from the first round of VRAP participants. This is usually one of the problems with a pilot program in general. So they say, we're going to do this for 2 years, then we're going to report to Congress on how it was, the end. And I'm trying to think of the other program we're running into a problem with this right now is the pilot program for off-base transition assistance program.
Mm-hmm.
So a couple of years ago, the National Defense Authorization Act commissioned transition assistance program training for service members who had already separated. So you're in the veterans community, you've been out of the military for a few years. We're going to pick a couple of locations. They chose West Virginia, Georgia, and Washington to do off-base TAP. Now, my organization argues that you don't know what you don't know when you're still in the military. You don't know the challenges you're going to face until you're out. The problem is this is due to expire, but we don't have outcome information on it yet. So once Department of Labor is able to publish that information, we'll be armed with something to go to Congress and say, here's why you need to consider expanding VRAP and make a viable case for it. Right now, aside from the anecdotes that we hear from veterans who used VRAP, that's the only argument we have, and Congress wants to see hard data on whether this program was successful. And for those of you who are interested, the bill is the VRAP Extension Act of 2013, and it's HR 562. Thanks, Steve, for passing that along.
What would this mean? So the question is, what would this mean for active duty service members? Would this bill also cover those folks? So it's interesting because the way the legislation functions is technically right now that's actually the exact people that it will cover, the folks in currently. The ones who are looking to separate, they would be the ones who experience that gap. Since it doesn't, since it doesn't come into effect till 2015, it actually doesn't affect anyone who's in the system already. So if you're on active duty, it will affect you once you separate. It's that separation period that it becomes a viable option for you. I believe it's 3 months after separation. So between 3 months and 3 years to exercise this authority to be considered an in-state resident for tuition purposes.
Add on to that. And if you're active duty, currently, again, under the Higher Education Act, which kind of has complete jurisdiction in how institutions administer everything from your Pell Grants, student loans, to anything and everything, and how, again, reporting in the Higher Education Act that was passed in 2009, and of course, there's currently a reauthorization going on, which all three organizations are a part of, to make sure that that provision stays within the Higher Education Act once it does get reauthorized. It's ensuring that active duty service members, their spouse and dependents, if you're stationed anywhere for a consecutive, and I believe it's 30 days, you are automatically granted in-state tuition for the purposes of going to a institution of higher learning. So again, this is more concerning for those who are transitioning out, who pretty much is considered a nomad for whatever, for the reasons of joining the service and joining the military, and again putting your sacrificing everything to put yourself on the line for this country. So there are two different legislations that covers you while you're in active duty, and of course this will cover you once you transition out of active duty service.
Next question.
Looks like we got a lot of questions.
Yeah.
If a veteran is currently enrolled but recently transitioned within 1 year, will they be eligible to receive in-state tuition rates when this bill takes effect next academic year?
Oh, Okay, so this is a good question. This touches on what we talked about before. The question was, if you're currently enrolled, but you are within that 3-year window of separating from active duty, will this cover you for in-state tuition? And this is something that we think needs to be hashed out in rulemaking. Unfortunately, that probably won't be the case. Protections like this sometimes are just a look ahead. But these are conversations that we can have during the rulemaking process. And when they publish the draft rules to the Federal Register, we would certainly believe that if this is something that you can publish a comment on and say this needs to have a look back for veterans who are currently enrolled but are within that covered time period, within that 3-year time period. So when the draft regulations are out there, that's something that our organizations can also take a look at and go to bat for. Again, historic precedent shows that it will be a difficult fight, but again, I think that's something that we can ask for.
Next question. We'll take about 2 or 3 more questions. Once we conclude here, you're more than welcome to reach out to us. We'll make sure that our information is publicly available, and certainly you can reach out to our organizations in general. So the question is, in essence, this ends the Yellow Ribbon program. That's actually not accurate. So this will basically cover up to the amount as any in-state resident would have, but the Yellow Ribbon program is not necessarily impacted by this. Steve, did you want to add a couple?
Yeah, and something else that people need to understand, that not every school is Yellow Ribbon. Well, this legislation covers every student, and our main concern again was representing the best interests of our constituents and our brothers and sisters in arms, was ensuring, especially for those who were going to an institution that did not have Yellow Ribbon, they were covered. But also, Yellow Ribbon only covers those who are 100% eligible for post 9/11, and for those under the percentile coverage, we're not even eligible to even get Yellow Ribbons. But by doing this, we ensure that we cover all service members, and I should say veterans, who are in that window of time frame of transitioning, that they will cover under this particular legislation. And I'll let Ryan.
I wanted to add on to that as well. One of the issues with Yellow Ribbon agreements, we fully supported Yellow Ribbon agreements from the get-go, and for the public schools that took advantage of this opportunity to make up that gap, those schools deserve to be applauded, because you identified a gap and sought to fill that need through current policies. The problem was most public schools didn't seek to do that, and those are the veterans that were hurting. To echo what Steve and Will said, this does not make the Yellow Ribbon Agreement obsolete for public schools, because again, this is only a protection for veterans within 3 years of separating from active duty. So we have plenty of post 9/11 GI Bill eligible veterans who have been out for a number of years, may have chosen not to pursue higher education for any number of reasons. And we would encourage public schools who are still interested in serving these veterans to enter into Yellow Ribbon agreements, again, to offer them a reasonably priced education. In addition to that, one of the issues with Yellow Ribbon agreements is that many schools will cap them. So yes, we're a Yellow Ribbon participant, but we're only a Yellow Ribbon participant for 15 students, or up to a certain dollar amount. To us, this is problematic because it can be confusing to the veteran when they're applying. Yes, this school is Yellow Ribbon. No, I didn't get one of their Yellow Ribbon scholarship slots. We encourage schools to still participate in Yellow Ribbon, public schools to still participate in Yellow Ribbon, to take into account those veterans who don't fall within this 3-year transitional benefit.
Great. Let's go ahead and take one more question here.
As a follow-up, is the VA requiring public institutions to demonstrate the academic success of their student veteran population? In other words, if the school takes the money, you must show student veteran matriculation.
Ooh, great question.
This is a good last question.
Yeah.
We can spend like 20 minutes on this.
So the question is the VA requiring academic outcomes tied to the funds coming from the GI Bill? Short answer, no. That is not something that's tied into it. In fact, if you look at our Million Records project, we can actually go in much deeper on academic outcomes. But presently, that's something that SVA has been working very closely on. SVA has been working closely on, and my colleagues here are also extremely interested in this issue. I'll go ahead and pass it to either of you to talk a little bit further about it, but in short, no.
Do you want to go first?
I will say one issue at a time, but I will say this is comparing apples to oranges, as this particularly tackles a financial situation for veterans who are taking financial burden. Now, I will say there are other vehicles in which our three organizations are working very closely with, to include the Help Committee and the Companion House Education Workforce Committee through the Higher Education Act, but again working also with the Department of Veteran Affairs to ensure that the Department of Defense, Department of Veteran Affairs, and the Department of Education are also working together through, again, different vehicles to obtain this data information, to be able to analyze it quantitatively and be able to provide some insight. And you will see one of those collaboration, again, will be with Will said is the SVA's project going on, which I know that was phase 1, and I'm pretty sure they will have multiple phases as they continue to evolve that and expand what they already have already issued and reported out. And again, we'll continue to tackle many issues, but I think it will be one issue at a time in how we're tackling it.
All right, where to go next with this? Student veteran outcome data, I think, is the crux of this question, and this is something that our three organizations, and I've got to give a lot of credit to SVA for what they did with the Million Records project with the National Student Clearinghouse and VA. This has been an issue at least in the 7 years that I've been working veterans education policy, probably longer. But basically, we don't have good data, good outcome data on veterans. A lot of times what you'll read about veterans in higher education is about, oh, well, there's so many veterans at a school and their graduation rate is 30%. This has become a joke to me and my colleagues, and the reason is because by Department of Education standards, none of us is considered a graduate. And many veterans don't fall into that category of what Department of Education monitors for its graduation rate. It's only first-time, full-time students within 6 years of enrollment. Now, personally, I had a break in enrollment and was actually disenrolled from my college because of my deployment to Iraq. So when I came back and reapplied to the university, I was no longer considered a first-time, full-time student. If you ever drop below full-time and you take part-time classes, you are no longer considered a first-time, full-time student. So if you have adult obligations or anything like that, or if you are on active duty and you took part-time classes, so hey, you're going to use my tuition assistance benefit and take class here or there, by the time you transition off of active duty and go to whatever college you choose, you're not being tracked by Department of Education. We've also seen a lot of erroneous figures reported out there. One of them was echoed only yesterday about saying that 88% of veterans drop out within their first year. We've talked to VA about this, and VA's own numbers directly contradict that. They believe the retention rate is what, about 60%? So that actually very closely mirrors the civilian population in starting 1 year and continuing the next year. What we're really encouraging VA to do is do a deep dive into their data systems. So in the past, what they've monitored is you're a veteran, you're eligible for a benefit, how many months have we paid you, did we pay you accurately, and how many months do you have left? That was pretty much it. But their database they believe that they can track a lot more than that. They believe they can track from one semester to another, from one school to another, whether you advance in your education or not. But I guess to sum it up, one of the biggest problems with a lot of the reports you'll see about there about how veterans are doing in higher education is when we look at them, basically they've selected data to display adverse outcomes that aren't valid.
I'll lastly touch on this, that it's very careful. We have to be very careful with the data, as some will use that to benefit their own means, to sell their products, to sell an idea with false data. And again, it's not just that, but understanding that we need to have the right data, because policymakers when we're spending, like policymakers say, $40 and $50 billion on the GI Bill. We want to make sure that when we stand in front of Congress and we have to fight for this particular piece of benefit amongst all the other benefits, and of course, DC or anywhere else is always competing interests, we want to make sure that we have the right data when we're presenting our arguments into Congress or to Congress to defend what you have rightfully earned and your help to readjustment and reintegration into society.
Sure. We'll take one more question. We've got a couple more minutes.
We're getting some good questions.
Regarding supplemental education for student veterans, does the Act provide any kind of funding to tutoring?
So the question is regarding supplemental supplemental support. Does the Act provide support for tutoring services? So I'll say not explicitly. That being said, if you are in a higher institute of higher learning and you're on the GI Bill, I would be surprised if you could not find some sort of academic support service on the campus. So I guess in an indirect way, if you're using your GI Bill, you could argue that that is the case, but it's not explicit. So that being said, we have found in just our general conversation and in our site visits to various schools that the tutoring is an extremely important component. So anytime that's an opportunity, I think we would all agree that we highly recommend that. So thank you for joining us here today, and I appreciate the time of my colleagues here from the VFW and the American Legion. We hope you learned something. We're happy to kind of unpack this legislation that was extremely important, reviewing both the historical context, the work that you all have put in to make this possible, to give us the power when we're on the Hill with legislators and talking with our policymakers about how important this work is. And also, if you would like to follow us or track us on Twitter, you can always use the hashtag InState4Vets. That's INSTATE, the number 4, Vets, VETS. Just feel free to shoot any additional questions to us, and we'll answer those accordingly. Otherwise, we appreciate your time and look forward to answering further questions.